My name's Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, and we want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices both in San Francisco and Sacramento. PPIC has just released a report titled Career Pathways and Economic Mobility at California's Community Colleges, authored by researchers Sarah Bohn, Jake Jackson, and Shannon McConville, and with research support from Courtney Lee, all who are here today. So we're very excited to have you. We'd like to thank the ECMC Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the Sutton Family Fund for their support for this important work. And additionally, we'd like to thank the ECMC Foundation and the Irvine Foundation for making this lunch possible. I know you guys come here for the research, but the lunch is a nice touch. We should have received a report on your chair, and there are additional copies at the registration table. The report, a very long appendix with some very wonderful charts, are available online, as well as the slides you're going to see today. For today's program, we're going to first hear from Shannon, who will present the main findings from the report. Then Sarah Bohn will moderate a discussion with a fantastic panel of experts. And finally, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. When we bring around the microphones for question and answer, please wait for the microphone, because we record this, and we are hoping that our audience online will be able to hear the question as well. You should have received an agenda on the chair, and all the speakers' bios are on the back side. So in the interest of time, we won't be doing extended we only do brief introductions today. And please note that we also have that online audience again. A couple things before we begin. Later you'll receive a survey. We love our surveys, so please take a few moments to fill those out. And then lastly, please silence your telephones or your cell phones. PPIC does amazing work in our higher education center, and so I recommend that you go online and look at some of that work. But this is one of my favorite works that the Higher Education Center does, because it links data from two distinct agencies, the Community College Chancellor's Office and EDD, to answer the important question on whether CTE programs are improving the economic mobility of California students. This linking was made possible because of the vision of the Chancellor's Office, Governor Brown's office, and EDD, and we want to thank those partners for helping us get this data and pulling it together. But that's why I wanted to bring this to your attention. This is a great example of the type of questions you can answer if the state had a longitudinal student data system. I know. This is what we're asking you, right? PPIC has long advocated for a longitudinal data system, and this would reduce the amount of time of agreements that I would have to go around and talk to the segments. So it's not just selfish, but for the state, it would be really important to be able to link this data without having to have individual agreements. And I'm happy to report the legislature just passed the budget trailer bill, which creates the California Cradle to Career Data System Work Group, with a goal of a report to DOF, our Department of Finance, and the legislature with the proposed structure of a data system by 2020. We recognize that this effort will be difficult, because otherwise California would have already done it. But we hope that the reports like this will help the work group understand the importance of a longitudinal data system, and that will help speed along the access to it. I'd like to now introduce PPIC Senior Research Associate Shannon McConville. Her work focuses on examining safety net programs, assessing the effects of Medicaid coverage expansions on individuals involved with the criminal justice system, and analyzing the employment outcomes and economic returns of career technical education. Let's welcome Shannon.
Thanks so much, Deborah, and thanks to all of you for coming to hear about our research. We're very excited for this presentation. So I will get started. So career education, it's also commonly referred to as career technical education, CTE, vocational training. These are all kind of interchangeable terms. And career education really serves this dual role of trying to meet state workforce needs and the labor demands we have within the state, while also providing training opportunities for students that can improve their employment and economic outcomes. In California's current labor force, about 1/3 of jobs are what we consider middle skill. That is, they require, based on the current education levels of workers, some college training, but less than a bachelor's degree. And based on occupational projections, that share is expected to remain about the same. Career education is a key component of the state's K-12 and post-secondary public higher education systems. Our focus is really on that post-secondary piece of things. So this is our California Community College system, who is the largest provider of career education in the state. In 2017-18, the community colleges conferred nearly 100,000 career education credentials. About 90% of these credentials are in one of 6 broad areas. These include health, business, industrial technology and engineering, family and consumer sciences, public and protective services, and information technology. And it's these 6 areas that we focus on in our report. And I will say that within these 6 broad areas, there are hundreds of programs across the colleges, the 114 colleges throughout the state. These programs also are really designed and serve a very diverse group of students, everyone from recent high school graduates looking to enter the labor market to older adults who are looking for retraining and others. So it's really serving kind of a diverse group of Californians. And kind of in recognition of the important role that career education does play for the state, the legislature and policymakers have allocated about $1.5 billion in the last 5 years to expand and strengthen and support our career education programs in the state. And one of the key things with that is really to recognize this potential for them to provide economic mobility for the students that complete them. But what we'll see is there are really large differences across the different programs and the different pathways that students choose that impact kind of how economically beneficial these credentials and completing these programs can be for these students. And it's really, this information is really crucial to help inform students who are selecting the programs they want to go into, but also efforts, the ongoing efforts that are being made at the throughout the community college system and more broadly to really create these effective career pathways in our state. And so first we start with the estimates of the wage returns for individual students to these career education credentials. And here what we're really trying to estimate is the value of the credential itself, rather than say what students, kind of their own personal characteristics kind of enter into the equation. Another way to think about this question, would students' earnings have gone up a similar amount if they had not completed this credential? It's difficult to isolate this relationship, in part because individuals' earnings increase over time, kind of on average, but also there are lots of factors that likely impact employment and earnings outcomes that we just simply cannot observe in data. And so, as we mentioned, the only reason we're really able to do this is because we have this very rich longitudinal data. The Chancellor's office provides us with information about the students who complete the credentials, when they completed the credential, and then we're able to match that with quarterly earnings records for these individuals from the EDD. And so with that, we're able to look at these, rather long wage histories that allow us to control and kind of net out a lot of these individual effects that we think may be going on to try to get as clear of an estimate, again, of that value of completing this credential for a student. I'll also just mention that because career education students do tend to be older, most of them do have a relatively significant wage history prior to earning the credential, which also helps us to develop these estimates. So what we see from this, on average, completing a career education credential confers about a 20% wage gain to what we would have expected that individual to have earned in the absence of this credential. You can see that for those who complete an associate's degree, which is the kind of highest level of credential available within the community college system, it's higher, it's about a 32% gain. But what you also see is, so for long-term certificates, these are those that take on about 1 to 2 years to complete, and short-term certificates, which are that are shorter to complete and take less than 1 year. Students still see returns above what they would have been expected to earn, but if they return to the community college system and earn another credential in the same program area, this is something we refer to as stacking credentials, they also receive additional gains to earning that second credential and even a third credential, and that's especially true for those that start out with short-term credentials in terms of the second and the third being kind of important ways to continue increasing their gains. And so, And while the return or the value of this credential is kind of critical information, it's also important to consider and examine how students' kind of overall earnings levels grow over time and can improve economic well-being. And from this chart, what we see is for most students, those returns to career education credentials means that after they've completed them, and that's where the 0 point is, that's the quarter in which the student earns their first career education credential, we do see the share of students earning at least middle income earnings levels starts to accelerate and trend upwards, whereas it's relatively flat kind of in this 4-year period prior to earning that credential. Although this kind of accelerated share does vary across these different pathways, whether students earn only associates, whether they stack from a short-term credential. Something I'll note, though, is that for those that do stack, it may take them longer to see the earnings, but 6 years out, a lot of these have kind of converged, so people are, on average, earning things. Still, even 6 years after completing the first award, between 10 and 30% of students are still in this low-income earnings level. And so what do we mean by middle income earnings? I think that's a key thing. And this, we classify middle income's earnings levels relative to regional poverty thresholds. So these vary across the state to reflect the differences in cost of living across the state. And we use these, and so for example, in the Central Valley, to achieve this middle income earnings level would require these are based on single individuals, earning at least $23,500 in annual income. And then the high is in the San Francisco and San Jose regions. That same number would be $32,800. And again, this is for a single person. And using these thresholds not only kind of gives us the ability to assess, to account for the fact that cost of living does vary quite a bit across California, but it also provides a more absolute and data-driven assessment of what it takes to make ends meet in the state. And so because we're also concerned with equity and understanding how different groups can improve their economic outcomes, this is particularly important, say, for disadvantaged student groups or underrepresented student groups, and how career education can support them. We also looked at the wage gains that we presented in that first slide across different demographic groups. And so we do find that across all groups see returns to career education credentials, although some groups less than others. On average, females see larger returns relative to men, while credentials earned by African American and Latino students seem to confer less value to those students than to their white and Asian counterparts. Much of these differences that we do see across groups, we also look at things across regions in the paper, are really driven by what programs and what pathways students are pursuing and completing. Although I will say there continue to be gaps for some student groups, African American students who complete a similar program and pathway still do see less returns. And so again, as I mentioned, a lot of this has to do with differences in the value of different types of career education credentials, and the pathways that students pursue. This may not be surprising to many of you. Health programs do by far confer the largest value in this career education space to sub-baccalaureate credentials. The differential wage gains that we do see across programs is very consistent with the larger literature base that finds the same thing. So health confers quite a bit of value. In this work, we find that students who complete information technology or business credentials see a much smaller return. In some ways, this, again, explains the differences we saw across those student groups. Women are overrepresented in health. That's likely driving their higher gains. Likewise, white and Asian students are also overrepresented in health, which is likely what's pushing them up, while Latino and African American students are underrepresented in health. And so those are some of the things that are driving some of these differences. Still, other factors that we're not able to control for, such as regional conditions, discrimination, and other realities may also be at play in kind of these differences we see across groups. It's also the case that, again, when we talked about it, that returns to credentials don't necessarily tell the whole story. If earnings levels are very low to begin with, even earning a credential that does give you a significant gain in what you would have been expected to earn, if that's on a very low base, you're still going to remain in this low income earnings space. Family and consumer science, 70% of the awards conferred in this space are in early childhood education, is an example of this. We do find that students who earn these credentials do see a return to what they would have earned otherwise. Nonetheless, it takes students who complete the degree or credentials in this program area much longer to reach middle income earnings relative to the other areas. And that really points to this backdrop or the context for all of this, which is that labor market realities for certain occupations and across regions are a key consideration when we're looking at looking at this information. And so given that, here we're highlighting some of the high-level occupational categories that do have training opportunities available within the community college career education programs. And what we're doing here is we're plotting the number of projected new middle-skilled jobs. So these are, the jobs and occupations and those students who have some college but less than a bachelor's degree. The number of new middle-skilled jobs statewide is what's on the horizontal axis. And then we're plotting that against, again, these multiples of this regional poverty threshold. So what that means is, say, the higher the point or the occupation group on the vertical is that they are higher paying occupations. So you see protective service, for example. Current workers in protective service, this is law enforcement, firefighters, of which there are several community college programs. Current workers have solidly what we consider upper middle income wages, more than 5 times the poverty threshold. Some of the others kind of fall somewhere in between that. The other thing I'll notice, so personal care, where you see quite a bit of statewide or projected new jobs. This is largely being driven by the aging of our population and the need for in-home care. While there are a lot of those jobs that are going to be needed in the labor market, they pay low wages. And so this is kind of an inherent tension in some of this. And finally, regions are also a vital consideration. And given that regional labor markets vary considerably what jobs are available, and demand for middle skill workers also varies across regions in the state. We can see that northern and central regions of the state, the Central Valley, Sacramento, Inland Empire, more than a third of projected future middle-skilled jobs will be middle-skilled jobs. This compares to, say, San Francisco and the San Jose region, where only about a quarter of projected new jobs are in this middle-skill range, and there are a lot more high-skill jobs that are projected to be needed in those regions. And so, kind of what does this mean for us, and kind of looking forward, what can this help tell us? So this can, inform colleges as they provide new students coming into the system with about what programs and opportunities there are to pursue. I think the Guided Pathways Initiative is really focused on trying to do just that, help students as they enter understand where they can get to, and this can help provide some of that context. There are other tools that the Chancellor's office has that also endeavor to do that. Our findings also support initiatives that kind of may help students complete these high return credentials. So if students may not be able to enter and immediately complete an associate degree, which is why they turn to a short-term credential, but some of the efforts to provide increased financial aid, cover total costs of college, could help those students kind of sort or pursue these higher return credentials right off the bat. It also points to efforts that could shorten the time it takes to maybe pursue these pathways. In previous work, we saw that some of the pathways, say from earning a short term to a higher level credential within a program, are not really well laid out, say in course catalogs. And so if we could shorten some of that time by telegraphing that information better to students, they could get into the labor market and see these gains sooner. And finally, a better understanding of how different employers and industries across regions can inform the offerings within the system, and how students maybe can come back and improve their pathways is another consideration, and also the focus of future work in this area. So I thank you, and with that I'd like to invite Sarah and our panelists up to the, is it a dais?
Thank you, 3 fantastic ladies, for joining us today for this panel discussion. At my far right, we have Alma Salazar, who's Senior Vice President of the Center for Education Excellence and Talent Development for the LA Chamber. That was a mouthful. I hope I got it right. Next, we have Assemblymember Autumn Burke, who represents the 62nd District of Los Angeles. And among other leadership roles in the legislature, she chairs the Select Committee on Career Technical Education and Building a 21st Century Workforce. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, we welcome Marty Alvarado, who is the Executive Vice Chancellor of Educational Services at the California Community Colleges. Thank you all for being here, and please refer to the bios on the back of your agenda for a little bit more detail on these fantastic ladies. We want to reserve more time for discussion, and we'll be bringing in their background and experience to the conversation, but I encourage you to look and more closely at their background. I'd like to, we have about 45 minutes or so for discussion and then audience Q&A, so please get your questions ready, both for the panelists as well as for Shannon on the earlier presentation. And I'd like to try to cover kind of three big topics in our discussion today, at least. The first being kind of looking institutionally at the challenges and opportunities responding to kind of the facts that Shannon presented. Second, thinking about this from the student level. So what does it mean to really broaden access to economic mobility for especially disadvantaged students in California, or disadvantaged workers generally? And then last, to look forward to the future and preparing our workforce and preparing Californians for opportunities going forward. So let's just dive right into it. First, we'd like to talk about kind of institutional and policy role in this space. As you saw, our research illustrates that students take a wide variety of pathways through career education at California's community colleges, and not all of them pay off spectacularly in terms of economic returns. But there are a lot of recent efforts at statewide level and across colleges to kind of address those challenges. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kind of speak to that challenge and opportunity from the position that they sit in, drawing on their illustrious backgrounds. So let's start with Marty. I'd like to ask you what colleges and the system are doing to ensure that programs link to in-demand, high-value careers, and to what extent kind of this idea of the potential earnings factor into those decisions at the system or the college level.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to join this panel. This is great. I would say that just to start with, we have what I would describe as a two-prong approach. I mean, it's multi-pronged, but I'll focus on two areas today. We have moved forward with the investments that have been made around establishing regional infrastructure across the state to really focus supports at a local level. We talked about, or was discussed in the presentation, the diversity of regional economies across the state, and so really trying to localize support, customize it, while also ensuring that each region has the support they need to move forward. So the types of supports that we've implemented are regional labor market centers, hubs of excellence they're called, and they provide data and reports and information on the regional economies and the regional industries, and they partner very closely with the community colleges within those areas, and then also deputy sector navigators, which are designated industry liaisons, and so they are really designed to coordinate and facilitate interactions between the colleges and the regional industry partners. The second level I would focus on is the state level resources. So we've also developed several tools, things like Salary Surfer, careered.cc.edu to try to help students navigate the various industries and opportunities that exist across our system, while also trying to make transparent what are the earning projections for students as they move into these career options and select their training programs. So I think one of the things that we are still wrestling with, if you will, is how do we remain responsive to the local industry need, and I think personal care industries and occupation projections is a really great example of this. This is where the jobs are in many regions, and there is a huge need, and yet we have the reality that these are low wage or lower wage opportunities. And so that is something that each of our institutions is currently wrestling with and really trying to reinforce and build in viable stackable credentials. So we have a very strong initiative right now called Guided Pathways, and we're really focused on figuring out how we map curriculum in ways that actually maximize those return on earnings for short-term and long-term credentials. I think one of the challenges has been the historic divide between transfer and career technical education, and that's something that each of our institutions in our system as a whole is wrestling with. We saw from the stackable credentials that credentials alone, short-term or even long-term associate's degree are only going to get our students so far. And as our cost of living continues to rise in the state of California, it's really critical that we have bridges and opportunities and links to further degree and attainment so that students can actually really see middle-income salaries moving forward.
Thank you, Marty. So Marty mentioned kind of the state level tool. So that seems like a natural transition to Assemblymember Burke to perhaps speak to the state or legislative actions or policies that can set the conditions for those kind of linkages to perhaps work better.
Right, and I think first it's important to realize that as an Assembly member, when I first got into the Assembly, we had a chair of education budget that actually didn't even know what career technical education was. I literally had to bring him down to my community and show him what a successful career technical education program looked like. And for those of you who didn't read the back of this, which includes me, I represent a district. The eastern portion of my district is a very challenged area. West Athens was named one of the most challenged areas in the state of California about 5 years ago. And then I have a western portion of my district that's like Marina Del Rey, Venice. It's like $995 a square foot when you're buying a home. So we have this kind of plurality or this kind of polarity in my district. And so when we first got here, career technical education was really important to me because we do have actually industries in my area in which people in the eastern portion of my district were making $75,000 a year with a certificate and an apprenticeship program. And how did I make sure that my whole district really started to understand what career technical education really meant and what the possibilities were? Because 5 years ago, and I can't believe it's 5 years ago when I got here, 5 years ago when I got here, it really was an education to my fellow members. It was, I remember when we first started working on the $900 million for career technical education, there was only a handful of us. Whereas last year when we looked at extending that money, we had 27 co-authors and it was bipartisan. So I would say the first thing statewide is educating members and senators as to how important and that career technical education is not what you used to think it was. It is not a dead end. And that's why we're super supportive of the stackable credentials. We have been because it is not a dead end. We have learned and your studies have shown over time that really it is a step forward. It is a step into what is possible. And we've seen that in our district. So we do, I chair the Career Technical Education and Building a 21st Century Workforce, and it's a select committee. And we do hearings around the state, and both are important. They work together, and it's why we didn't just do Career Technical Education or Building a 21st Century Workforce. The pathway has been super important to us, and we've learned a lot during those hearings about how we connect, how we make sure that it's actually a very local decision as to what programs are provided at community colleges. I think that's something we actually had to learn. And we have seen like farm career technical education programs that have been extremely successful. So we do a lot of legislation, or we actually even sometimes we facilitate more than we legislate. Sometimes that's actually one of the bigger bonuses of things that we are capable of doing. So we'll have a hearing in an area, we will connect the community college system with our local WIB, and we will create from what the jobs are available there, create that pathway and that communication so that we can create a curriculum for all of these industries, especially in my district. I have aerospace that needs jobs, or that needs workers, and they need to be trained, and we have very capable, competent people in my district. So facilitating those relationships has been an important part of being an assembly member for me. And then moving forward, we have bills like AB 23 this year, where we're connecting actually the GoBiz with a new deputy of business so we can connect that workforce once we create it, because it's our job, we need to create it. Once we create it, we can make that connection so that people can get the workers that they are looking for. I think for me, I do a lot of work in poverty, and what I have kind of tried to explain to people, and I know it's like later in the conversation in here too, but this notion that we're just trying to get people jobs is very outdated. The reality is we have working poor. We have people who work full-time or two part-times or 3 part-time jobs, and they are still living under the poverty level. And the reality is we need to start focusing as a state, which I have been very happy to see my colleagues move in this direction, into a place where we understand that a job isn't enough. We need to be training for this new millions of jobs that are available in 2025 that are careers. A job we should stop talking about minimum wage and what a minimum wage job looks like, because with a certificate and with all of the social safety nets that we are providing at this point, especially looking at this year's budget, we can lift people up. We can provide transportation. We can provide the childcare. We as a state of California have really created a social net, and you really look at the budget, we really have done a significant improvement on that safety net so that people have the time and the energy to go build their life for a career. And doing things like the stackable credentials and building that pathway through education is the only way we're going to do that.
Thank you, Assemblymember Burke. You spoke to the connection or the importance of connecting the jobs with the training and the students, and I'll toss it then to Alma, who's had many, many years of experience actually facilitating that. So, Alma, can you please enlighten us about how we can better how we can get to kind of better linkages between other stakeholders like employers and the students and colleges that really so vitally need to connect with them?
Sure. I mean, I think first it's important to acknowledge the successes that we've had. And I think the policies that we've implemented, particularly around K-12 strong workforce, community college strong workforce, to some extent AB 86 have put us on the right path to build the foundation, to be able, as Marty said, to build the infrastructure and the partnerships needed to move this forward. But I think coming full circle to the top of the presentation, I think for us now, given that we're several years in, the importance around how do we continue to provide a continuous improvement process to this work, and really re-examining what successes have we had, what's worked, what's not worked, and are we now at a point where we need to decide how do we continue to tweak and provide improvement around this work. And I could tell you one area in particular, and I'm excited that we're finally moving in this direction, but data continues to be an integral part of what we need to do. And so as we examine a statewide longitudinal data system, what I would implore is the importance of ensuring that this data system is available to local regional economies, particularly with an emphasis around the end user, so that we all have a level set around how it is that we're moving the needle, particularly when we're talking about underserved populations. I think you could point to exemplars, and I would say in our region, Orange County has done some excellent work with their community college regional consortia. There's been intentionality around looking at the data, looking at alignment to the key industry sectors, making sure that the programming that is being offered is serving our students and that there is direct alignment. We would love to continue to see that be brought to scale in all of our regions, but more importantly, it's not just the interconnectivity between K-12 and community college. How do we bring all of the regional stakeholders, and how do we ensure that we are creating alignment between systems who all have a shared agenda and purpose to better serve our most underserved student populations? I could tell you from an employer-facing entity, one of the things, and I think it's one of those both opportunities but yet unintended consequences, when most of the initiatives invite employers as a partner, unless there's coordination between the systems in engaging employers, oftentimes what we create is more employer fatigue than less employer fatigue. Employers are of an entirely different mindset. They want want two things. They want to come in, they want to support, they want you to tell them exactly what it is you want them to do, and they want to remove themselves, or not remove themselves, they want to remain engaged, but they want to just be very to the point and engage with you at a certain point in time. Additionally, I think being able to communicate our successes so that they're able to demonstrate that the time, investment, effort made is actually yielding. And again, I would say also where we're engaging regional business intermediaries like chambers of commerce and business organizations who are adept at being able to provide that basically kind of code switching, who I often joke that I'm trilingual. I speak business, education, and workforce. I'm sure you've heard me say that before, but that's an acquired skill set. And that means being able to respond to more than one client, more than one customer, and creating programmatic efforts that directly align to what employers need. Additionally, employers also working with businesses to make sure that not only are they prepared to receive our student clientele, but have a socialization around how do we make work environments work for them in a way that they're thoughtful about what they do and don't do that either ensures individual success or doesn't. Let me pause there.
Thank you, Alma. Before we move on to speaking kind of from a student perspective, I wanted to give Assemblymember Burke and Marty the chance to respond to this question about longitudinal data in the state, which obviously you keep hearing from the PPIC side we're very invested and interested in, but the role that kind of building that data system statewide might have in improving the CTE issues we're talking about today.
I mean, listen, I completely rely on everything you do, so, and she actually does that because she comes to our poverty meetings too, so for me, having the data obviously is incredibly important. I don't come from a body that is always data driven, so it has been great to be able to, like I said, even things like the success rate of those who have entered into career technical education. Those are the things that not only can I come back and create legislation from, but then as we're doing the legislation, it makes it that much easier for me to pull a budget chair in and say, look, I have the data. And so data collection for us is incredibly important. Like I said, not every decision across the street is made from data, but it makes it so much easier for us to push for some of the things that are really important for us to do.
I would say, as a system, the data infrastructure is a critical priority for us at the moment. I think everyone at our system office really believes that the data, available, reliable data, and the research around the data is critical for the equity agenda that is really at the core of our reforms. There are a lot of assumptions and implicit biases around interactions and engagements for students and which types of students belong on which paths, if you will. And I don't think it's always malicious or ill-intentioned. However, I think what we see in the data as it's presented is the impact that it has, the very real impact it has on individuals in our communities and their ability to provide a living, sustainable wage. And it was interesting because as I thought about the data that was being shared, the majority of our students have families. And so even the earnings that they're showing for a single individual don't really tell the whole story, given that the majority of them have families that they are responsible for supporting. So I think for us, the data piece is not, is so that we can make data-informed decisions, but also so that we can shine light and sunshine some of the systemic inequities that our system is unintentionally or intentionally producing, given how we're structured, and really use that information to drive many of the reforms and the tough conversations that we need to be having across our system.
Thank you. Let's switch now to speaking more about students. And Assemblymember Burke, I'll ask you to respond first to maybe set the stage for us. As we see in the data, the majority of CTE students in California, they tend to be older. They have long work histories. They're more likely to come from historically underrepresented demographic groups. And they also often have relatively low or poverty level earnings before earning a credential in the community colleges. So so maybe you can circle back to your points about the working poor and, the fact that there are even more Californians than we observe in community college who are working poor, and how can we better maybe help them access these programs or other programs or the other kind of supports that they need.
We spent a lot of time having that conversation in the poverty task force, and I think one of the recommendations that was created, and one of the things that we're working on, and I don't know the number, but because there's like 5,000 bills, but but we are working on, like I said, having that safety net. I think creating, whether it's childcare, because so many of these people are adults. And they have families, and as a single mother, be clear, childcare is a huge issue. But not just it's healthcare, it's childcare, it's creating that safety net. And so for us, what we're doing is we're working on creating kind of a single application. So like if you apply for WIC, you then will see not only, you don't have to run to the next place and get on the next bus and go 2 hours to the next building to get your Social Security, or get, not your Social Security, but get whatever your other programs you are, that is available to you. What we are going to try to do is create a system in which you apply for one program, and then everything that you are eligible for is provided for you. So that is right in front of you. I think it's incredibly important because we are talking about people who need places to live, food, childcare, health care. And when we provide that safety net, we give people the opportunity to focus on other things like building a career, getting a credential. It is really hard to think about those things when your kid is hungry, or when you're worried about if you're going to have a roof over your head. And these are the things that as a state we provide and we're proud of, that we're supposed to be proud of, but yet we make it very, very difficult for that safety net to be complete. We leave a lot of holes in it for people because we make it so challenging for them to access the programs. And so for us, I think it is an integral part of lifting families out of poverty and making sure that we're not just creating like another minimum wage job, or really creating the opportunity for someone to get the education that they need to really lift themselves up, is taking the holes out of the net. And I think the best way to do that, listen, talk about data. There is no good reason why one person cannot put, I shop all day on the internet. I know what the internet is capable of, and I know what technology is capable of, and there's no reason we cannot come up with an algorithm that looks at each individual and says, look, this is what the state has to offer you to make sure that you can move forward with your life and we can lift you up. There's no reason for that. So, we are not technically great in the state of California. We spend a lot of money on it and don't always get to our goals, but I think this one is incredibly important for the future of lifting poverty. And when we talk about poverty in my office, we're talking a lot of times about deep poverty. So you're talking about a family of 4 living under $13,000 a year. They need a safety net. You cannot lift that family up without making sure that that safety net is complete, and then they have the opportunity to focus on getting a credential, building a life, and building a career.
Thank you. Marty, you already mentioned how a lot of students have families and other challenges, and building on what Assemblymember Burke highlighted, what are the challenges there for colleges in actually helping students be successful in completing a credential?
Oh my goodness.
It's a big one.
Challenges. I'm going to write that down because I want to say in achieving the credential. I want to say the first thing I want to say is what Assembly Burke's comments really triggered for me, having run the Cal Worked-In and run the Welfare to Work program for almost a decade. The dignity and respect and personalizing and humanizing the individuals who are in poverty, I think, is a fundamental challenge across all of our systems. The idea that, we're sort of assuming, I think inherent in a lot of our systems, and education is true in ours as well, there is an assumption that folks aren't willing to work hard at accessing resources and or navigating our systems. And while it may not be explicit, it's very much assumed in how we structure the operations. And that's, if we don't make it difficult, people will take advantage of whatever we're trying to provide. And I think similarly, so I have seen that in the social services realm, and how we sort of advocate for students on the community college side to access and navigate those resources. So this is exciting news. I think on our side, we are also trying to be mindful of the inherent assumptions around social capital, navigating college structures that our students are required to walk in the door with, or we assume that they aren't willing to work hard to figure out our bureaucracies. And so I think our efforts right now, again, on the career technical side and on the guided pathway side, if you will, as we try to bridge those two, is really taking a hard look at our infrastructure and our processes to figure out where we are creating unnecessary barriers for students, and where we are mitigating their opportunities to really advance by having divides between the stackable credentials, if you will, or the divides between the different credentials that are available, and students' access to opportunities beyond the initial certificates. I think the challenge for students in accessing our systems start all the way at the beginning of how they find out about our programs and where they're directed, which programs, how often are we referring students to child development programs as opposed to encouraging them to take IT or healthcare programs, and really thinking about the full wraparound services that students need, the child care and other support. So I think we're really taking a hard look at what we're doing to facilitate or hinder student progress and really trying to make some changes.
I'm glad to hear it. It is a big challenge, and I want to ask Alma if there are lessons from the workforce development or employer side about training adult workers or those with barriers to employment that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, and particularly in the workforce development system, you've already seen where the system itself is held to, I think, very strict accountability measures. And they are able to gauge their performance based on very clear-cut outcomes that the workforce development system is expected to adhere to. I would say also there have been recent legislative efforts as well as investments that are really trying to strengthen the partnerships between not only the community college systems, but other CBOs who also play an integral part in being able to provide those supportive services, particularly for underserved populations like justice-involved youth or foster youth or others whom require a deeper set of services. Particularly as it relates to adult learners, we're starting to see some promising practices around vocational ESL programs. Obviously, it's been around for a while, but particularly those that are being directed at incumbent workers, and in continuing to implore the systems where possible, being cognizant of, particularly when we talk about the populations whom find themselves at these lower echelons of career advancement. You're talking largely about sometimes monolingual families who may not necessarily have, or maybe working adults, basically, are working poor, and how do we construct programs that take into account and don't require them to make the decision between education and work? And how do we continue to integrate services that allow and facilitate for that? As well as looking at ways in which we're providing for multi-generational approaches. And it isn't just our young adults coming into our systems, but the families and the parents whom themselves also need access to career pathways. So I think it's really about taking what we have and thinking differently and creatively about how we put those resources into play. And then I think from an institutional side, I absolutely agree with Marty that one, it's how do we empower individuals to take advantage of these opportunities, but also how do we ensure that our institutions aren't creating unneeded or unnecessary barriers for our individuals? And more importantly, how do we get the system as a whole to take ownership for helping us collectively solve for these problems? We know what the issues are. We know that not all communities are moving at the same pace, and how do we have a shared ownership over solving for this problem? And it has to go beyond Sacramento, it has to go beyond systems leadership, it has to get to the institutional level and the people who work in it who've got to be equally committed and understand the issues that we're trying to solve.
Wow, that's a powerful point. Before we move on to the next topic, I wanted to give Marty and Assemblymember Burke the opportunity to respond to that if you'd like.
I would say amen.
What she said.
No response. Yeah, I think that is the hard work. I mean, when you think about shifting systems, there are the policy levers, and I sort of have these debates perpetually in our office of, what is our role as state agencies? And for us, how do we balance the tension between compliance and implementing state policy while also understanding that this is deep people work? Right, there are 90,000 plus employees across our 115 community colleges, and at the end of the day, there are realities in terms of how they operate individually within their organizations that impact students' ability. So when we talk about an equity agenda, it has to be not only sunshining where there are issues and breakdowns in systemic structures that are perpetuating inequities, but then it also has to be, what is the equity training for all of the individuals who work across our system, and how do we become more aware around how what we do facilitates or hinders or exacerbates the problems and or helps to support moving in different directions.
I think we're good.
Okay. It's been said. Before we move to some Q&A with you all, I wanted to touch on one question about the future of work and ask our panelists to kind of answer the tough questions about the uncertainties of what's ahead of us. We know that California's economy in the future will change in ways that are maybe unexpected, further automation, robotics, climate change, all kinds of factors, right? And historically, our institutions haven't been that flexible in terms of being able to retrain workers for new opportunities that arise with technological change. So I'm curious to know if the policies or work on the ground today is taking this into account and might be, hopefully, making us more flexible so that we can respond to those kind of what happens in the future and ensure that more Californians kind of can take advantage of the opportunities that might bring in our future economy.
Since I dipped on the last one, I can do it. Yes, I think just transition is definitely part of what we are starting to think about as we move through legislation. And a good example is like cap and trade. When I first got elected, I had, and this is a stupid story, but it's important. When I first got elected, I went to this legislative Energy Horizons Institute where I got an opportunity to sit down with other senators and assembly members or representatives, whatever they're called in their state, and talk about energy policy. And what came up, interestingly enough, was there was a senator from South Carolina who said, listen, this is great. I'm learning about all this energy policy, but my people are starving. We've taken coal out of the system, and now we are literally, my communities are starving. They have no jobs. And I watched this man for 3 days beg he said, we'll build nuclear. We'll build whatever you want. I have got to get my people jobs. And I remember, and it has stuck with me since that day, the desperation on his face of what was he going to do for his community. And from that time when we started looking at cap and trade, actually even before cap and trade, we did build SB 350, and I tried to put in there this new just transition, which no one was talking about. What happens to that workforce, which are my people, who have these jobs in a dirty economy, and no one ever talked about what happens to them and how do we retrain them for a new job. And you can't take those people from their $75,000 a year job and then throw them into a $35,000 a year job. That's not a just transition. And I think from that moment, I have really beat this crazy drum of how do we make sure that people have an opportunity as we change and grow. Listen, I want to go to a clean economy like everybody else, but there are people with jobs who have homes, who have built lives based around those jobs. And how do we make sure we train those people early enough and are conscious of that transition? And whether that is a transition from being a clerk at a grocery store as that turns into an automated job, or whether that is a pipe fitter in an oil producing industry, how do we make sure that as we are doing that transition, as we make that change into our new economy, that we remember constantly that those are people who are going to lose jobs? And so it has become something that I think has actually started to seep into the system across in the Capitol. I think we've started to really understand that that has to be a process and it has to start sooner. So we did, for like cap and trade, we put in a study. What does it look like? What kind of jobs can we start to prepare them for, and what education systems will be needed to do that? And they're in the process. They just finished that study, actually. And it's important environmental issues, but it's going to be important in everything. I mean, someone told me, I haven't been to McDonald's in a while, but someone, because I'm really trying not to eat like that, but, you know, someone told me now there's kiosks in McDonald's that you don't, you know, and someone's got to fix them. Someone has to fix those kiosks. And by the way, I would rather teach that young man or woman who used to just press an automatic kind of cash register how to fix a kiosk. Because that is something he or she can take with them. They can fix a car, because a car is a computer now. That has longevity. The coding for that has longevity. And so there's a huge fear, I realize, of the fact that we're going to lose these minimum wage jobs. Oh my God, that you know, that we're so excited people have, which is not a great place to be focused. Instead of this really huge excitement of we can train people for this new economy, prepare them now, and those skills will be transferable across a plethora of different industries and opportunities. And I think it is a shortcoming to worry about losing those minimum wage jobs, because I do think there's so much opportunity on the other side that is going to be so transferable. It's just a matter of making sure that legislatively we do keep an eye on as we are moving forward through these transitions.
You know, I mean, as we think about the future of work, and in many ways it's already here, right? You can see where the fast pace at which business is moving and automation, and we're experiencing this now even in our gig workforce. And I think there's two things that, and if I were queen for the day, I'd want us to focus on. And I applaud the Assembly member for all she's done already to shore up the existing safety net, but I almost think that in many ways we need to reimagine the safety net. And how do we bring together business, labor, government to collectively come up with a new safety net, particularly for those who find themselves in vulnerable occupations or quickly changing occupations. That would be the first. The second, and this may just be because I've been doing this for 20 years, and I swear if somebody asked me, what do employers really want, again, for every nickel, or for every time, if I had a nickel for every time that's been asked, and just recently,
I think I've asked her like not that, so I'm like, oh God.
You know, while we are focused on career pathways, and we oftentimes place a higher premium on technical skills. I can tell you, having been around many business roundtables, many conversations for the past 20 years, all conversations cycle back to, I'm not even calling them soft skills anymore, they're essential skills. Mm-hmm. That's it. And somehow we haven't really absorbed this, and we don't focus on it, we don't place a high premium on it, and we keep focusing over here, hoping that it will solve for this. And it doesn't matter the occupation you're in or the level of specialization. If an individual does not have those basic foundational skills, their ability to ascend within a particular occupation or industry is limited. Mm-hmm. So somehow we just need to place a higher premium on that and stop accepting that it's happening through osmosis and students are just kind of experiencing this. There has to be greater intentionality around how do they acquire it, how do we assess for it, how do we facilitate and mentor, and whether that's lending human capital or whatever that is, or social capital, we've just got to. So if you ever ask a business person, what do you really want? I can easily answer that for you. It all comes back to essential skills.
And I might just throw in a new phrase to that one. A good friend of mine calls it HOTS. Higher order thinking skills, because they're not even foundational anymore. It's not even just showing up on time. It's being able to think critically. It's being able to problem solve. It's being able to work in ambiguity. And when we think about the low wage jobs that are slowly transitioning out, the jobs that are replacing them require a higher level of sophisticated thinking that are really foundational. So on this note, I would really say, two responses, and one is safe and one is questionable. I want to point to our Vice Chancellor, Shani Weber, who heads up our Economic and Workforce Development Division, because, Shani, you want to wave your hand? She's really the mastermind behind a lot of the innovative programs across our system on the economic and workforce development side. And when I think about our system as a whole, that's really where the innovation has historically lived, in thinking about the future of work and really thinking about how do we evolve our programs in really intentional ways that are really driven by industry, different apprenticeship programs, different innovation grants, all sorts of different opportunities to really iterate and innovate across our system. However, it has very much been on the margins of our system and has operated in spite of our system at times. And so this is the part where I would say, don't quote me necessarily, is there is an element inherent in the future of work that really requires that we think about the future of learning and what the evolution of the workforce across education, not just higher education, but education in general, is really a core component of it. I think that education systems have been able to really insulate themselves from the changing economy in ways that most industries have not been able to. And even when we think about the driving industry sectors, very often education isn't noted on there, even though it's one of the major economic drivers for many communities. And so as we think about the future of work, I really think that we have to start thinking about the future of learning and what the future of learning workforce needs to look like, and how we really think about shifting that paradigm, and similar to rethinking the safety net, how do we rethink what that looks like and what are the policies around supporting an evolved education system?
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Q&A, but I wanted to first thank the three of you for your leadership.
I'm 100% sure I've asked for that.
We discussed so many complex and interrelated issues, and I just really appreciate that your attention to those and your work in this area, so thank you. Now, questions. Please just hold for a second until a microphone can get to you. Thanks.
You spoke about the equity role in the public sector. I think the public sector is on, I work with SEIU Local 1000 here, the state workers. But the state and the counties have always had a role of providing an entry-level place for people to move up through the system to get some basic skills and to move up. I know SEIU's done a program, we've taken LVNs, turning them into an RN, where they went from $43,000 to making $95,000 a year. And we have a success coordinator who helps with those soft skills. And it's been through the community colleges, through the CAI grants, that we've been able to do this. The same with taking people working in the mailroom who are now IT specialists over in some of the state departments. So I wanted to ask you, how can the public sector, because I don't hear them, I hear private sector, how can we provide this engine for growth for so many of our citizens here in an area where you have jobs that have benefits and they're well-paying and they're middle-class jobs? So how do we do that in the public sector?
Great question.
Yeah.
You want me, yeah, that's a silent answer for you. I guess that's partly your answer. First of all, yes, listen, labor has done a great job. We're huge advocates of apprenticeship programs. They're so important. And for us, though, in my community, we do a lot with the WIBs, like workforce investment boards really actually have some of ours especially has some great programs that teach, what do we call them? Not soft skills anymore. What are we calling them now? Essential skills. Essential skills. Essential skills, which is what they are. As far as the public sector, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know that I would totally rely on the public sector at this point. I experience in my own building where people aren't necessarily always getting paid as much as I think they should be paid, and it's definitely not an equal pay system. Talk about implicit bias. I have people who work in my office who have been there for 18 years who were like pinholed into a scheduler's position, and I made them a chief because they had the experience, but a woman had to come in and be like, nope, over here where you belong. So I don't know that the public sector is any different than the private sector in some ways, except for obviously we have benefits and things, but we still suffer from the same bias and the same issues with pay. People have to leave our building to get paid what sometimes what they are worth. And I'm ashamed of that, and I talk about it, and we fight about it, and we have titles that we are in the process of arguing about what the title should be, because they ain't right either. And so I don't know that we're the solution. We should be part of the solution, and we should always be part of the solution. But it's the same, but we have the same battles that private industry has on a lot of those fronts.
But you have benefits.
We do have benefits, and while you're battling, we do have benefits. Well, I don't have retirement, but yes, everyone else does. Thank you for cutting me and pouring salt in that wound. No. But everyone else does. Yes, that's true. But to glorify it and pretend that we don't face a lot of the same issues that that private industry does would be dishonest.
This question's for Sarah. This is Scott Lay. I'm a recovering community college person. On the gender differential, I initially thought right away, oh, it's the health professions. But then later I thought, well, that's equalized by early childhood education and the other caring professions. Yeah. Did you dive more deeply into that gender differential? Or if you want to kick me to an appendix, that's fine.
There is a section in the report on this where we dove into it, and then a bit more in the appendix, as you might imagine. So that difference, the slightly higher wage return for female relative to male students, comes mostly from the fact that they choose programs, the choice of programs. And health is the main driver there, but you are exactly right to point out that these two spaces, health and family and consumer sciences, where childcare programs sit, are very gendered. So they are, I don't have the exact number, it's in the report or technical appendix somewhere, are very, women are overrepresented in those programs. It's just that the health return so far outweighs the negative or the lower returns to family and consumer science credentials, that we get that kind of overall increase for women relative to men.
Is it on? Oh, okay. So I'm Dr. Maureen White. I'm in the community college system, workforce and economic development. So my vice chancellor, Shani Weber, is here. Marty Alvarado, my former director, Dr. Deborah Jones, is also here. And some of our regional consortia talent is here. I wanted to respond about the public sector and not so much the union issues, and more of we are working on innovative pathways to public service. And I usually say this is not my father's state government job, because my father worked for the state government for 37 years. This is something where every sector in the state is represented in a public sector. So we're talking about all the skills that the community colleges train for. They're all in public sector, whether it's county, local, state, and there's many other areas. So I just wanted to let people know that we are doing that, and several people are involved in that program and project. And Randy K. Stevens is here from local government. So we just want to assure you that we are working on that. Thank you.
Thank you. The questions up here.
Hi, my name is Lance Gunderson. I'm with the California Industrial and Technology Education Association. We represent K through university teachers throughout the state. And although there were a couple of items mentioned briefly in the report, I want to make a comment and maybe get a response from you about those two that I think deserve a little more emphasis. And one was the K-12 system feeding into the community college system. I know that if we were to have a football team that started in our state at the college level and we're playing other states that started at a much lower level, we likely would not be the champions. And that is true for industry. There's a great deal of training that goes in. There's a wonderful manufacturer in Southern California, in Irvine, that makes high-end CNC machinery. They're the top in the world. They have told me that they would suggest a minimum of 4 years of training on their machines before someone become a machinist and using those. So having a very strong relationship with the lower grade seems like we would have a great deal of effect on the income of an individual, and not to mention their chances in a career. And I'm just wondering if there was any more emphasis on the high school and possibly middle school, or if that was, why that was omitted, if so, if it was.
That's a really important question, and it allows me to talk about data again, because we would love to see that pipeline, because that's a critical point, especially for CTE students who, some CTE programs at the K-12 level maybe could get you into a career that then you can move up from there, but not all of them do. And so that transition from high school to community college is a critical one. The data is just not connected, so that we can't, in our kind of style of analysis, evaluate that in the way that we would like to. But we recognize it's a critical juncture in the education pipeline in our state that could be strengthened.
Right.
Do you want to?
I would just add that I think we also recognize that the partnerships with K-12 are critical, and have a long history of working on both dual enrollment efforts as well as local promise partnerships that really try to facilitate stronger connections across the K-12 and community college. I think we've also been heavily involved in efforts like partnership academies and link learning efforts and other K-12 initiatives that are focused on really strengthening career technical communities that are both college and career, and so really trying to help support those efforts as well. So significant investments have gone into those partnerships, and they are ongoing right now. So, agreed.
Oops. Turn around, silly. Two questions here. I'm Stephanie with the University of Phoenix, but most importantly, concerned mom. Not my coat over. When talking, piggybacking off of what you're talking about, career technical education in our K-12 systems, really dialing it back a little further, really middle school age group here on strength-based finding and working in a junior achievement kind of level. And I know some institutions are utilizing that. We're utilizing that with our business and our partnerships and some of the applications. And I know there's work. How do we progress that where it's at every school and every student? Sorry, I'm super passionate about that.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Expand on that too.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in first because I'm sure she'll have the better answer.
No, I won't have the better answer.
I would say, as a concerned mom myself, that is the question du jour. I think we would have to have a CDE rep here also to really talk about what this looks like at the K-12 level. I think one of the things that is critical, sort of at the surface level, is how our communities and our parents and particularly communities that have more affluence and resources, how they view education and what the purpose of education is. And if you just think about the local, the recent scandal around testing and buying your kids' way into elite universities, I think we are really up against public opinion around what is the role of career education and applied experience and really transforming teaching and learning. And what that means for investments in our systems and the political push, if you will, to be able to move in new ways.
Yeah. So we did one of our career technical education hearings, and we had at the time, obviously, Jerry Brown's staff there, because for me, the kind of fight has been with the new now local control funding formula. What we were having a lot of trouble with is the reality is he did not want any earmarks. And so as hard as we would push, we'd say, we want this money for career technical education for each school. Even though his staff explained that he gets it and he understands the need, it's against the basic philosophy of the principle of local control funding formula. And so it was, and I was like, well, call it whatever you want. Like, we'll call that money whatever you want. Call it, I don't actually care, as long as it provides an opportunity for every school and every student to have these access, right? And at the end of the day, what we found was that they just were not prepared to do that because it was fundamentally not the belief system of how they created the new funding system. Will that continue? I don't know. We'll have to see, because things are different now. He's gone and we're all still here. But it is definitely a conversation we're having, and we pushed very, very hard. it is hard, and these programs are expensive. They're extremely expensive, and so we have found things like LA Trade Tech that are places where we can send multiple schools there, and trying to find a way to work it out where all kids have access. But I will tell you definitely, yes, we are having we have had the fight, we continue to have the fight, but the challenge has been, how do we, in a world where we're not allowed to earmark money for something specific, how do we get around that? So that's just...
If I can add one more thing too, because I think the other layer of this that always mindful, having spent a lot of time in these programs, partnerships with K-12, there's also an equity element of this, right? Where, to the extent to which districts and schools, how they approach implementing these programs matters for who gets potentially tracked and or who has access to. And so I think that's another layer of this that, that we have to be mindful of.
I don't want to steal the floor here. Because I'll let somebody else know.
Okay, we can come back to you.
Hi, thank you all so much. So my question kind of piggybacks off of that as well, but I'm thinking about the kind of great variety within the credential space and how there's just so many different options out there, and it doesn't follow the 2-year associates, 4-year bachelor's kind of standard model. So what tools are there available to students to try and make sense of all of those different credentials? And then also, how do we figure out some kind of way to equate, for example, a community college program with many of the for-profit colleges that also offer spaces, especially in programs that are impacted at the community college level?
Sure. Well, I could speak a little bit to an initiative that we're trying to roll out in LA County. And I couldn't agree with you more. I would say another wish of ours as it relates to a longitudinal data system is also, how do you ensure credential transparency? And how do you empower students and families to make informed decisions around what is and is not valuable in the credential space? We have actually partnered with an entity called Credential Engine. It's a national entity that's working with other states to create that credential transparency. But it really does require buy-in from the systems to want to be able to make their information available, and really looking at the entire credential offering space, not just public, but private, and pretty much the totality of entities who provide credentials. But I absolutely agree with you. I think, again, I think we'd be remiss as we're creating a statewide longitudinal system if within that there isn't a specific call out for credential transparency.
We work with LA City actually created a new kind of group that really, and we've worked with them and Cal State Dominguez, where they're providing a first level of credential and credential programs, and they provide a mentor that walks you through what's available, and then also the city is providing where you get your first you get your first level credential free. So I mean, I think that you have a city like big enough like Los Angeles, we can do that. But I think that something like that is probably going to be a good model, and hopefully a good pilot program to see how successful that is. And we've been doing that for about a year, I think now. And we kind of check in with them regularly, because I think there is an opportunity there on a scale like what the people that LA City has access to, and their ability to actually directly communicate with those folks, know who needs, kind of have a good idea of who needs it, who needs lifting, and to be able to have that conversation and bring them into a space where they're going to provide an opportunity for a first level credential, and then also provide that opportunity in a way that people can still go to work and get that credential in a reasonable amount of time, so they don't feel defeated, so they feel good about themselves, they retrieve their first credential, it's a good quality credential, and like I said, in a time and fashion where they can keep doing their work. I think that we're hoping that this is going to be a model for something new.
And I will just quickly say, I think that is definitely something we're working on in terms of clarifying the path. That is one of the pillars of guided pathways. But then also on our workforce side, we also have a lot of resources on our website, including Salary Surfer, which actually shows the earning potential of what the average earnings are for students who have completed those credentials, right? So it's not projected. This is on average what they make. And so we really working towards making that transparent.
Would any of you like to respond to the topic of for-profit colleges that I think you mentioned, and kind of how that, we haven't talked about that today, although it is a consideration in our research of how the role of community college versus for-profits in this space. and what that means for students, their debt, and other concerns.
I would just say quickly that I don't think that we have yet nailed down our messaging that really translates the total opportunity cost and the debt burden and what the true value add is of community colleges. And I think we're always working against our historical the historical perception of community college versus 4 years. And so I think that's an area where not only do we need to get more granular around what are the comparisons, but also really think about the overall messaging that's beyond the individual credential and really takes the whole package of the experience together.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you all for being here and staying till the bitter end. Thank you. Thanks again to you. Will the authors at least will be around if you'd like to ask us any specific questions about the report or other research.
My project should probably.